Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today's guest is Cait West. She's the author of this incredible book called Rift, which details her escape from Christian patriarchy. It's a really fantastic conversation, and if you're a fan of memoirs at all, this is a must read. But we really dive a little bit deep into the inner workings of the patriarchal kind of Christian movement, her experience as a woman within that environment, and what it meant for her to leave. And now start building, even though a foundation that she once knew has been cracked and just obliterated as she has kind of deconstructed that worldview. This is a really fantastic conversation. I swear you're going to enjoy every second. I do want to make one note. Unfortunately, I had an issue with the provider I used to record my actual interviews. It actually wasn't them. It was my internet provider. Had several issues throughout the interview, and I didn't realize till after that not only did the, kind of live playthrough of my recording look really glitchy and blurry, the audio was okay mostly, but it also didn't record the backups that the system I use typically does. So unfortunately, my angle looks pretty corrupted and rough, but Cait's looks fantastic. So enjoy her segment, but just please show a little bit of a little forgiveness to my side for not looking 100% up to par. I want to let you guys know that. But enjoy this conversation with Cait West. Grab a copy of her book, Rift, wherever you buy your books. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cait, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I know you have been going from interview to interview talking about your new book, Rift, which people can grab a copy of right now. If you were stuck in an elevator with me for a couple floors and you had to give like the 10,000-foot view of the book, what would you say your overarching goal with this book is?
Okay. Well, it's my memoir of growing up in Christian Patriarchy movement, becoming a stay-at-home daughter and escaping and learning how to survive on the other side of that rift. And my first goal is to reach people who grew up similarly, and so that they feel seen and that their stories are valid, because so often we've been silenced. And then also to help bring awareness to how abuse can harm people in various ways, and it's not always as visible as you might think. So yeah, that's probably kind of a rambly elevator pitch, but
No, that's fine. I think that's great. And I was telling you before we hit record, you obviously did not grow up in the kind of independent fundamental Baptist world, but reading through your book, it's like 95% of it is identical to the experience of so many that I've talked to on the show, so many that I know have listened and have shared their experiences. And so I think it's a timely, relevant book, and I think it's something that many are going to resonate with. So I think kind of going through the book, what struck me was the theme that I've been seeing across a lot of these memoirs, which is, I think of Kristen May's book, and she talks about evangelicalism always purports to bring order to chaos. And that was something that stuck out to me in her book, Jesus and John Wayne. And then like page 3 of your book, you refer to the toddler version of yourself as being not yet tamed. And I see this thing of erasing identity and pushing for uniformity. Why do you think that's such a goal within so many evangelical circles and subsects?
I think that the evangelicalism is this large system. It's kind of a machine, and people in the leadership of the evangelical church want to keep the other people under a kind of conforming control. And so I don't think everyone's always intentional about that, but definitely overall, I think the evangelical doesn't work until people are conforming. And so any sense of individuality or self-expression or being different or not following all the rules is going to be looked on as subversive or rebellious. Definitely that was the case for me. And so I think the people who are authoritarian leaning, like my father and the pastor in my church, would have considered that a threat to the order of the church.
You referred to your dad as authoritarian leaning, and obviously, as the book progresses, you see that grip really tighten throughout that experience. I'm curious, as much as you can look back, because obviously you didn't know your dad before you were born. Do you think it's something that started well intentioned, where it's now I have this child, it's the paternal instinct to go, I really want to protect this child. And so I find myself in this environment that seems to offer protection from perceived threat. And then you get a taste of power and control and start going down that kind of trail. Or do you think it's something where he was authoritarian leaning and this was the perfect outlet for that expression?
It's such a difficult question. I think I've seen both scenarios in the circles I grew up in. Some people came in to these churches, these patriarchal churches, because it promised safety. And then others came in, I think, because it was an opportunity to control with God's blessing. And so I personally think, I can only speculate, but I think that latter case is what my father was doing. I think he's always been, has controlling tendencies. And so I think the patriarchy movement gave him validation and the freedom to control his family, with God, this supposed God's blessing
Sure.
over it. So I personally think that's him, but I don't think that's everyone who's in this movement. It just depends on the person.
Yeah, there's a real spectrum like across stories where, I've kind of split it up even with pastors where like there's the abusive and then like there's the accidentally abusive where
Mhm.
they, and a lot of times this is like the second or third generation that's been raised with the theology that is leading them to lead in a certain way, even though their intention is probably good. But then you have the people kind of leading in some of these organizations that are creating systems that are made for the purpose of dominance and
Yeah.
control. When did you notice the shift growing up? Like, like I said, reading the book to me feels like you can feel this tightening grip and this suffocation that's happening as you're getting older and considering leaving, and then they're trying to keep you there. When's the first time you noticed that you were kind of in a cage, so to speak, where it's like, hey, I have a limit to what I can do, who I can become, and where I can be?
That's a difficult question because I've almost always known that my future was already mapped out for me.
Mm,
So I there's maybe a few of the early years before I was homeschooled where I didn't even think about the future. So, I think I was just living as a kid, fairly innocent. And then I was homeschooled starting halfway through kindergarten. And from there, our descent into the patriarchal madness was pretty quick. And so I was always was limited. And I remember having certain thoughts along the way of wanting things that I couldn't have. Like I remember wanting to have friends,
mm,
because I was very isolated, wanting a lunchbox, which is a kind of a weird fixation, but I just imagined having a locker and a lunchbox and how fun that would be. Um, and then, the older I got, wanting to do things like study piano in college. That was
mm.
a dream that I couldn't ever bring up. So I knew from even the imagination of something different that wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
So I always felt restricted, but it did get worse the older I got because there was this idea of I can't leave my father's house until I get married, and he would help me find a husband. And it really didn't hit me that this was wrong until my first courtship, where um, my dad was supervising, and then he ended the relationship. And then, a really long story short, I had a breakdown and I was really emotional. And then my dad was saying that I needed to repent of my feelings for him.
Yeah.
And that was the moment where that voice inside of me that I had repressed for so long was like screaming, like, this is not okay.
Yeah.
this is not what your life needs to be.
Yeah.
And so I was 21 then, and it took me 4 more years to leave after that. But that was like a really pivotal moment for me to know, like, this isn't okay. There's other ways to live, and I'm going to try to figure out how to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading through, and you could see where in your book where you're seeing, like, you're kind of, to keep the cage analogy, you're seeing these bars put in place that were probably always there, but you're noticing them as you try to move in different directions. And the stipulations of he has to have a college degree. I think it was 50,000 in his bank account. And there was some other stipulation that was like, essentially, nobody's going to fit the criteria that I have in place. And it seemed like the more you realize that, the more you went, okay, time to listen to that inner voice. I'm curious, and I'm curious because I've been asked this question, and I grew up from birth in a super fundamentalist church, and I was asked by somebody, where did that voice really come from? Like, if you never had any other outside option, if you never saw any other counter position, what made you even question? Because there's one way of thinking. So I'm going to turn that question to you. Where did that voice that you were suppressing even come from? Do you think we all innately have it? Do you think it's something that when you have those moments where a family member says, oh, you could really be successful as a musician if you went to this college? Like, what were those things that made you realize there could be something other than what I'm in?
I think that we all have that innate sense of self, that intuition, that inner voice, whatever you want to call it. I think we're born with that because I think that, just as human beings, that we have that innate sense of self. And my reasoning would be because of how I was repressed and so limited, I felt like I was shrinking, and like my brain was shrinking, and my heart felt so, well, like I just felt numb, to be honest. And so I know how that feels, and I know now how it feels to listen to my intuition and to have a voice and to have agency in my life. And the contrast is so extreme, how I feel alive now versus how I felt. Like, I thought about death all the time as a child because my life was not like lively or fun or fulfilling as a kid. And so I do think that we're born with it, and that because some of us have it so repressed, we don't remember a time when it was very loud. But I can just go back through my past and pick up traces of when I had these thoughts or these feelings, and I remember purposefully keeping them to myself, but knowing that that was me and that wasn't some outside voice telling me what to do.
No. It stood out to me when you said that you had no language for depression. Like, you were experiencing depression. You were experiencing, a lot of suicidal thoughts that I think, many have heard echo that, where you don't even really even know how to describe the feeling that you're in. But then you've since developed, obviously, a vocabulary to be able to write a book about it and talk about these experiences. For those that are listening who are maybe where you were a couple years ago, and they are just now learning the vocabulary to define their childhood, their experience in the church, experience in a patriarchal home, what can they expect from the journey of learning how to identify what they've experienced? And how do you brace yourself for learning a vocabulary that probably doesn't speak well? We often imagine that we went through something bad and we can identify that. But then sometimes as we work through the process of learning what we went through, we realized it was maybe worse than what we went through. Or what we thought we went through. So what would you say to people who are getting that vocabulary for the first time and learning to tell their own story to themselves?
Yeah, that's such an important thing to do, I think, is to learn how to tell your story, at least to yourself. It's not going to be easy to work through all of that. I think it's hard to prepare. It's kind of like people say you can't prepare for parenthood. You can't really prepare for what this is going to feel like, because you've never done it before. And processing trauma and understanding the vocabulary of abuse, it takes a lot of work to do all of that. And on the one hand, getting vocabulary and understanding that what you experienced was abusive, or gave you trauma, that might be shocking to your system in the sense that these words have never been used, you were lied to, you were told this was love. It can be really a shock to your whole body. On the other hand, it can be really liberating to know that you weren't suffering or struggling for no reason. This was caused by somebody else who is harming you. And so it's not your fault. There's language for it. There's a way to understand it and be able to express yourself now. So both of those things can be true at the same time. It's a lot to go through. And I hope people can find, a support, therapy, support groups, whatever they need to feel less alone, because it's a hard journey to do by yourself. And for me, writing has been the way to process my story and try to take that pen back and tell my own story. But that was really difficult. And there was a time when I did too much of it and I didn't take any breaks and I had to go to the doctor because
Sure.
I was having a breakdown. And so it's not, your feelings are valid, when it's a struggle. It's for good reason. And so often when we've suffered abuse, we minimize it to survive. And so even after we're away from that situation, we continue to minimize it. But that is going to stop you from getting help and getting healing.
Right. Yeah, if you don't know what the wounds are, it's hard to treat them, And I've been promising I'm not going to be the annoying person that just watched The Matrix for the first time this year. So I'm trying to keep my metaphors from that movie so down, because
I like The Matrix. It's okay.
It is a really good movie. And I realized when I watched it, like, people are annoying for a reason about this movie because it's such a apt metaphor for so many things.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go down the red pill rabbit hole right now, I promise. But the thing that stood out to me in the movie, there was one line of dialogue. And of course, throughout the movie, there's all these things that I've heard people reference, give metaphor, the red pill, the blue pill, like unplugging, like all that sort of stuff. But the one line of dialogue that really stood out to me in the film was when Neo is unplugged and he says, "Why do my eyes hurt?" And Morpheus says, "It's because you've never used them before." And that was like, okay, well, as a former fundamentalist, that hits me like a freight train because you have this entire system in which you exist, again, not as your fullest self. And you have a worldview that's not your own. And when you leave, you're very much like I related with the characters where you unplug, and freedom looks like uncertainty and a little bit of sense of danger. And there's unknowingness. And like, there's so many things that really start hitting you. And that's why it's so scary to leave that system. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't kind of situation. And so, when you're sitting there as a 23-year-old and you've got your laptop and you're searching all these terms, is there part of you that wants to slam the laptop shut and say, I don't know what all this is, like, it's better just to stick to the system, stay in this? Or was it, I got to unplug, and whatever this is, it's going to be better than where I'm at?
I think if I had done this when I was younger, like if I had access to a computer when I was like a teenager, that might have happened. But at the point that I finally got the guts to search on the internet for what was happening and trying to figure out some language, I was extremely desperate. Like I could sense that I wouldn't survive this if I stayed in my parents' home. And I mean that very literally. I just knew something had to change. And so I kept searching and searching. I found books about Quiverful and other people who had left and writing on their blogs. And I just read as much as I could in private, trying to hide it. because I just needed all the information. I realized so much had been kept from me and I had been lied to, and I needed to get all of the information that I could.
Like you said, you're at this breaking point where it's like something has to change. Like my survival depends on it. And I think this also is going to resonate with many listening. It's a spiritual abuse is such a nefarious form of abuse. And, during the process of deconstructing myself, I wrestled with what is spiritual abuse? Like, if I don't even know if there is a spiritual realm, what does that mean to me? And what I've kind of come to personally is that it's using the threat of a God figure to get you to do something.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether or not there is or isn't any of these figures, if the person who's being told that believes it, then it holds weight and it's going to affect them in a serious way. And so that's a particularly nefarious form of abuse. But mental abuse by itself is such a nefarious form of abuse. And you mentioned a confrontation with your dad in the book, and you imagine him physically hitting you because now people will believe you. And I guess coming to terms just personally, how were you able to flip the switch to say, okay, this is abuse, even though I don't bear marks of abuse that you would generally think of, even though I don't bear a bruise or a cut that I can point to, this is abuse. And then even deeper and probably more scary is, when did you feel comfortable telling other people without the fear of, are they going to believe me? Are they going to say I'm overreacting? Are they going to say it's tough love? Or all those things that we sweep away in culture, in general. Like, how did you go through that process of like identifying, like, okay, the stuff I'm reading and this lines up and this is what it is?
Well, first off, when I learned the term abuse, I did the wrong thing and I printed out the article and gave it to my father and asked him to consider if this was happening. Didn't go over very well. Because when you're an abusive person, you don't like to be confronted. And so he was very defensive. But I still was naively thinking, like, if he only knows, maybe he can change. And then I told my pastor, there's a scene in my book where I tell my pastor, and then he tells my father that I told him. And that's that scene where my father is really angry. And I was thinking about, well, maybe if I had bruises, people would take me more seriously because I felt in constant pain. And psychic pain, like, you can get very physical manifestations of that from psychological abuse. So like just your whole body aches, migraines, stomach issues, all sorts of things. Your body can manifest that pain because it's trying to like process it. So I was in pain, but nobody could see it. And that was really frustrating. But I learned from those two interactions not to tell people. And so I just had to figure out a way to get out by myself, which I did eventually. And I didn't tell people about this for years because, why would I? Why would I tell people something if they're not going to believe me, or they're going to think I'm weak or stupid or a liar? So I didn't. And then I kept seeing this happening. I did go to church for a while after I left, and I saw abuse there and nobody taking it seriously. And I saw abuse in other churches and just in general, nobody understanding how spiritual abuse is extremely harmful.
Yeah.
And that's when I got angry. And the way I processed my anger was writing about it and starting to talk about it online and realizing how many people have suffered this is what keeps me going, because I don't really enjoy talking about abuse. It's not like a fun thing for me, but even this week, a couple articles came out and I did the mistake of reading the comment section, and people, usually men, are saying really misogynist things about that I'm a liar, that I'm doing this for money, that I have gained weight, which I don't see how that's relevant. all sorts of terrible things people say when you talk about abuse and you tell your story. And so it's not a surprise that a lot of women and a lot of people who have been abused don't talk about it because you get publicly shamed or worse. And but I keep telling myself I'm the one who sees all the private messages and all the emails. There's so many of them that I get of people telling me their story, not being able to talk about it publicly, but feeling that they feel seen when I share my story. And so if I can do that and hopefully help change this sense of misogyny in our culture, I mean, I'm going to do everything I can to do that. But yeah, it's hard for, I feel for the people who are shamed so much just for telling their story.
Yeah. It's difficult because I have many people over the last 4 years or so, and they've emailed me and people that have never shared their story.
Mhm.
And there's been a lot of cases where I'm sending them to police because they've never even gone there. I've sent them to lawyers because there's possibility that if they file something in the next year, they can see something happen.
Yeah.
There's also been many I've encouraged like not to share their story publicly because I can sense that that's not something they really desire. Like they, you know, I've encouraged them to share it with someone, but sharing in a public format is something you can't undo. And it's something that is a very scary decision. And it's speaking to what you just said, and I don't know if this is a question so much as like I share the feeling about it, is it can be hard to encourage people to share their story when you know what's coming, when you know that even with law enforcement, I've had people in certain states where I know law enforcement's not going to handle their assault case well.
Yeah.
There's people where I know if they go forward in the community they're in, it's going to be really difficult. And then beyond that, social media and post, like if you post your story to Twitter, it's not going to be an overwhelming showering of love and support. And so I guess, you know, just scaling back into leaving this realm, your support system, or I shouldn't even say support system, your system that you're in, your world that you know, the familiar world is gone. That foundation is cracked, which is such a theme throughout the book. How do you start building when the foundation is cracked? Because like that's the piece that it just seems daunting to go, okay, everything that's familiar is gone. Now I'm in a culture that I was always taught was the enemy. I don't know how to survive in this world. What's the first few steps you would advise people to take when, you know, trying to build something when they don't even know what they're necessarily building on at this point?
Yeah, and it's so tricky. It's so tricky to figure out what works for you because everyone's going to be different. For me, I felt like the foundation I had before was a lie. And so it felt like I needed to start completely from scratch just to figure out how do I exist in the world. And so what I recommend is focusing on finding your sense of self and finding a sense of safety within yourself. Because the world you left was unsafe. The world you're going into probably feels terrifying. And if you can tap into some kind of groundedness within you, that's what you can hold on to when you're moving through the world and trying to figure out what you want. And so that can be very practical, like finding a room or a closet where you can go sit and be alone and just think and feel and be safe. Or artistic expression, writing for me. So it might be painting or some other kind of art for someone else. Listening to music and seeing what you like. Just like having that connection with yourself and your individuality and figuring out what that is and giving yourself grace as you figure that out. That can help you find the sense of safety that you need. And then you can go out and start practicing making decisions and what do you want to do with your life? For me, going to the library was amazing because I could access the internet and I could access books and I could think about what I want in my future. And all of that is practicing your agency when your agency was stripped away from you before. And so it does take work to practice. And just like anything, it's hard. But it's definitely worth it, because the life you had before wasn't really fully living into your true self. So give yourself grace. It's hard, but it's so worth it to be able to be your authentic self.
I'm curious, on a somewhat lighter note, what are some things that you didn't know that you liked or enjoyed or were interested in until you experienced them outside of that world? Was there any authors, books, music, movies that you now are like, I can't imagine not having this part of my internal kind of collection of interests? Was there anything that stands out to you that maybe you couldn't have imagined while in?
Yeah, I mean, so many things. I mean, the bar was pretty low for me.
Everything.
I love reading. So books have always been my way of escape. And then when I was a kid, I mostly read like classics and things that my parents approved. And now I read everything. So even something like the romance genre, which I would never have been allowed to read, right?
Sure.
But it's like a way to tap into like your sensuality and in a story that I never had experienced as a kid. So sometimes I feel like I'm reprocessing like adolescence with books, or just like movies, and not worrying about looking up all the bad words and all the bad scenes to skip. So just watching a movie that looks interesting for no other reason than it's like, I want to watch it. And I really got into gardening. I'm really not very good at it, but I found that it's really lovely to go outside and plant things and be away from all the noise, because I'm on screens a lot for work, and it's just nice to be in. It's just nice to be in nature. And also, I never thought I was much of an animal person, but now I find that I am an animal person. I have a cat, and he's a big part of my day-to-day life. Because he's always been home with me, because I adopted him right after COVID started. So all those things, I feel like I'm building a life, and I keep changing, and that's cool too. Like, this is the first year I got into playing cozy games. I've never been much of a video game player, and just playing a game and like having fun and not having to have a justification for how I spend my time.
Sure. Right. Yeah. No, we just got a dog like a couple months ago, and I was never an animal person. We had a dog growing up when I was really young, and I told my wife the other day, I was like, this is the best and worst thing I've ever done for my mental health, is having a dog. So when we first got it, I was like, because everyone would always say, oh, it's so good because you know, they can be emotional support and all this sort of stuff. And then I told my wife, Tara, I was like, see, I'm so anxious that I look at the dog. I'm like, why is it looking at me like that? It's like judging me, or it feels mad at me or something. But it's been really, really cool. You're into the romance novel world. Douglas Wilson dipped his toe into that world recently. Have you read his book?
Wait, does he have another new book?
No, just his
the robot one.
Yeah, the robot one.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
I haven't read it. I didn't think it got really good reviews. I didn't want to waste my time.
That's fair. No, just kidding. I had to mention it. Yeah, I'm curious. One of the things that you mentioned in the book, and I don't know, I have a sense, I think, of where you're kind of at in this journey, but you talk about the experience with the church itself and with faith, religion, and there's a section of your book which I wrote down in here that I would just read this section, but I won't read you your book back to you for 5 minutes. But you talk about people in the church having a totally different experience sitting in the pew with you, and you write in a very beautiful way. Go pick up a copy of Rift so you can read it that way. But you talk about the hymns for you and the experience of that versus the hymns for them, and the sitting in the pew and hearing preaching for you versus for them, or being in a community of people versus them. And I think it was a really beautiful part of the book, probably my favorite section of the book. And for those who buy a copy, it's page 187, so you can read this exact section I'm talking about. But to me, it spoke beautifully to the fact that our experience paints our perspective of things that maybe inherently aren't a bad thing. Like having a religious service is not necessarily a bad thing. Sitting in that environment is not necessarily a bad thing. But when you've been harmed by religious trauma, it can paint that entire experience to where it's an unhealthy thing for you. And so, what has your experience with the church and faith look like, even since writing the book, as you keep grappling with that conversation of what is spirituality for me, what is religious practice for me, and how do I make myself feel safe while also not, cutting off a vital part of human existence? Like, what does that look like for you? As much as you're willing to go into it, I know it's also a private journey in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a continuing process. Back in the day, I used to think everyone's supposed to have one right answer and you're supposed to be really strong about that and never doubt. And that's just not how life works.
Sure.
I did go to church for a while because I wanted to hold on to faith after leaving my family. I thought that um, I was deconstructing the idea of God as a patriarch, right?
Hmm.
And so I wanted to still be part of the church because I thought maybe there's another way to see it. And so I got really into like progressive and feminist theology and studied a lot and researched a lot. And at the same time, going to a church that was, looking back, pretty conservative. I thought it was not, but because compared to my upbringing,
Yep.
anything is pretty liberal, but it was very conservative. And I was having all these experiences of trauma going to church and nobody understanding my perspective. And at the same time witnessing, like I said before, like abuse happening in the church and it not being taken care of correctly. So I decided that church wasn't for me.
Mm.
And then when I stopped going to church, I started thinking that this religion wasn't for me. Just based on what I believe and after studying. And so I don't want to antagonize anyone's beliefs.
Hmm.
But for me, organized religion doesn't work. And I'm okay with that. And I'm okay with uncertainty and curiosity. At the same time, like for those who are experiencing PTSD or religious trauma, sometimes that's just like the environment you're in. And maybe you can find a spiritual community where you feel safe.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I would say look at your belief system, where you got these ideas from, because sometimes I think some of these beliefs can be inherently harmful. Like, in my opinion, the teaching of patriarchy, that God is a patriarch and men are in charge, that's a toxic theology, in my opinion, and I don't think it causes any good. So it can be both. It can be your perception. It can also be what's really happening. Could be really
Hmm.
harmful.
Yeah. I'll bounce this off of you because I'm curious what your thoughts are. One of the things that I've really pushed for in my own life, and also talking to friends and encouraging them in certain ways, is pursuing intentionality in decisions. And I think the reason that the deconstruction journey can feel very bumpy for a lot of people is that it's one of reaction. You're in a
Mhm.
toxic environment, and so you jump into, like what you said, you find yourself in another environment that feels less bad.
Yeah.
But then, I talk about it before. I jumped to Mark Driscoll out of the IFB because
Mhm.
he was so much better than the people I was listening to.
Yeah.
I would always be like, I remember telling people, I'd be like, I found this new pastor. He's super gracious, super humble, like he's so much different than the guys that were screaming red face
Yeah.
in the pulpit, all day long. Obviously I don't hold the same view now, but it's one of those things. And then into the John MacArthur world, who literally, I just watched a video 2 seconds ago before
Yeah.
doing this interview, where he's saying PTSD is not real, like
I just
all
watched that
this.
too.
Yeah, we should
So
have
I'm
just talked
upset.
about that. I immediately wrote for the interview, was like, who do I know it's a trauma therapist I can have on to talk about
Ugh.
this? But you find yourself ping-ponging back and forth. That's a common thing. And I think taking that extra step to be intentional in knowing why you're switching, or knowing like what direction you want to go before making the plunge of committing to an ideology or group, is something a lot of people just don't do. And I think it's why you see people leave who become kind of the default fundamentalist on the other side of the aisle, where it's like,
Yeah.
basically my belief is the opposite of whatever they said.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a healthy way to operate either. So do you think that in the lack of just certainty, like what are some things that are like absolute non-negotiables for you in terms of, okay, whatever I'm exploring, like these are kind of the ways that I test them to see if this system is healthy versus unhealthy, or if it's something worth pursuing, like in very, very basic terms, like what are the red flags you look to avoid immediately, where it's like, I'm not even going to step my toe into this realm?
Yeah. That's so many things come to mind. First
There's a
off,
lot of red flags we've collected over the years, right?
yeah, I look to symptoms of high control religion as
Mhm.
a good framework for evaluating a community. And so if there are areas of control, if there's so for instance, Robert Lifton's book, I can't remember the title, and then Stephen Hassan's BITE model talks about behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. If there's aspects of that in the community, those are huge red flags to me.
Yeah.
So, controlling what your week looks like, controlling what you wear, controlling who you hang out with, those kinds of things are, to me, the red flags I look for. And on the opposite side of that, what I think is important is to practice, each of us should practice our agency, right? So decision making for ourselves, thinking through what we want, what we believe, and trying to evaluate other people's voices, but through this filter of what do I know to be true? And that can be really tricky with a lot of, a lot of things are subjective. So it's not always like there's one right answer. So sometimes letting go of the black and white is healthy, and just saying, this is what works for me and that's what works for them, and we can coexist. To me, I don't practice a religion anymore, but I still hold on to some things that I think a lot of religions include in their value system, which is loving other people. And so for me, that includes taking care of myself and trying to be healthy and heal from trauma so that I don't perpetuate it. And then also loving other people unconditionally and treating other people with kindness and respect. And so those are more of my guiding principles. And understanding that I'm going to make mistakes and I can be sorry for them and work to be better and not be so rigid, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right. You mentioned the threat to agency, and in your book, as you know, because you wrote it, you talk about like being taught independence, especially as a woman, specifically as a woman in this context, was counterproductive, is the wording you used, because the whole system relied on your subjugation and dependence on that system and on the men in that system. As someone who, again, there's so many things I've said throughout the course of the show that now I'm like, well, that's not even quite true. But in a broad way, the system of patriarchy is set up to serve men in a way where I've noticed that even men who leave these systems don't look beyond the harm done to them. Like they'll see, oh, I was treated poorly, which they were in many cases, but they don't go a step beyond that to look at the experience of others around them. And so in this case, obviously, their female counterparts in the system who had, for lack of a better phrasing, had a worse experience than they did. Now, I'm going to caveat that by saying I don't think that a patriarchal system serves men in a positive way, because you're
No.
eliminating 50% of the input you can have in your community. You're eliminating having an actually healthy relationship with a spouse. You're eliminating having the input of someone who has, in many cases, better intuition than you in most circumstances. Like, it is a harmful system for both. But on paper, on a basic level, the system is harming women on a different plane than it is men, and in a more severe way. I'm comfortable saying that. What are some things that you wish men would understand about the female experience within these like religious groups, and how can they help facilitate kind of healing from those environments? I know that's a massive question, and you could probably write an entire book about the patriarchal system that explains some of this, but what are some things you think are missed when you see well-intentioned men addressing these issues but missing the mark on addressing the experience of women?
Yeah. I'm going to acknowledge that I have a limited perspective here. I feel like I'm a creative writer, so I don't do scientific research or
Right.
like data about this, but I do think that our individual perspectives can be helpful. So first, about men and patriarchy, I believe that the whole ideology is dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means to me is it's trying to fit people into these rigid gender roles where you can't be your authentic self because you're trying to constantly conform to someone else's authority or control over your life. And so I think even men often don't fit well into these boxes. And unless you're a narcissistic person, you're going to have a struggle being this patriarchal man.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, if you're not even a straight man. So like there's a lot of things at play here that patriarchy can harm men too. So I agree with that. And also, I think when men's, and especially in our current context, men have a lot of social privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't understand all the things that women think about on a day-to-day basis. So even as simple as there's this recent trend on TikTok where women are asked if they'd rather be in a forest with a man or a bear. And
Mm-hmm.
100% they say a bear because, like the comments are eliminating of like women saying, well, at least I wouldn't have to sit at the dinner table with him afterwards. Right. So like safety for a woman is very complicated. And men have often been the perpetrators of violence and abuse towards women. Not always, obviously. And men don't have to think about their safety in the same way. So just the way the way our society is structured, that's just how it works currently. And so I think it's hard to see past your privilege. And I think one similar thing, but not the same thing, would be it's hard for me to see past my white privilege to understand what it's like to be a person of color. I can do my best to understand it, but I will never be able to inhabit that,
Sure.
what that feels like. And so I hope that men can take women seriously and believe them when they are telling their stories. And you can't make it a direct comparison. So like often I see when a woman tells her story, men will like, I've never seen this happen. Like she's crazy.
Right.
Right. And so like you can't make a direct comparison because you're not a woman. You don't understand
Yeah.
what that's like to live in a woman's body
Right.
in this world. And so don't make that direct comparison because it's just not going to help you understand. But listen and listen more. And yeah, I think working to check your own privilege. So like as a white person, I work to understand how dynamics how my position in society works, right? So like I have certain privilege just because I'm white. And me understanding that can help me check my privilege and not use it as a tool of power or control. And I can work to try to level out my surroundings better. And so I think men could do the same thing, where they can check their privilege, and you walk into a room, or well, for instance, like you're walking down a street and you're following a woman, like she just happens to be ahead of you. Like, understand that she already knows you're there, and she's like clocking how fast you're walking, and like that's a very literal sense of safety. But in church spaces and communities, being aware of how women might feel, not saying that they do feel that way, but just being aware of that and asking what they want, not just assuming things, but just say, what do you want to see here? What would make you feel safe?
Yeah. Yeah. That assumption is never helpful about in any regard, with any person. But yeah, I definitely like that advice of not assuming how something's going to land. And I forget where I heard the quote, but I've thought about it constantly since hearing it, where it's like assume the best of others' intentions and assume the worst possible impact of your actions, and I think about all the time as a content creator, because I wish more people would assume the best of my intentions at times, but I also try to really take the second half, which is assume the worst potential impact of what I'm saying. And like you said, we only know our experiences, and so we can tend to miss the mark when it comes to addressing everybody as if those people shared our experiences or shared our perspective. And the truth is, I was never a 13-year-old girl in purity culture, surprise, like that was not my experience.
Yeah.
And so in my perspective, it's better just to bring those people into the conversation and hear what it was like for them and act accordingly. It's like the cartoon that I love the account, Naked Pastor, and I love his drawing where it's like the council of the church council on women, and it's like 20 guys in suits, like that's really, it's like Righteous Gemstones. It's like it's too close to real life. It's like a documentary.
It's painful,
that's just how it is, but I think that's really, really helpful, not assuming. And also, I would just go even a step further. Like you said, there's things that women consider that men don't. Like you mentioned earlier, like even comments on appearance is not something that like people can vehemently disagree with me and that doesn't come up, like that's something that's a default launching point for conversation. The most I'll get is like people say, oh, you sound effeminate, or I get that kind of stuff from the wonderful men in the church. But you've got things like that, or the TikTok trend, which I thought you were going to mention, which is, where someone will share like a 7-minute video, and then there's like this guy on TikTok that like will stitch the video and then say, here's what they were going to say. Here, I got to the point, and it's like that mentality of like just truncating someone telling a story is just stuff that like you don't see happen on the other side. Like it's like, okay, you get 60 seconds or less to tell us what happened to you. We get an hour sermon every Sunday, to talk. There's a lot of different perspective there. So I think that's really, really helpful. For those that are wanting to continue this conversation, obviously I'd love for them to pick up a copy of your book. I'll get my little display, go grab a copy of Rift. What are some other resources, maybe some things that you found helpful? They don't necessarily have to be weighty, heavy book, but like anything that's been helpful that you'd recommend people add to their Rift playlist, as it were, to kind of help them kind of keep this style going in a helpful and informative way.
Okay. Speaking of playlists, I do have a playlist for my book, which was really fun to create, just about different songs. So that's on Spotify if you want to listen to it.
Yeah, and I'll definitely for that for people.
Okay. On a serious note, I do work with a nonprofit called Tears of Eden. They help spiritual abuse survivors. So that's a resource if any of this conversation resonated with you. I also have a podcast with Sherry Smith and Claire Heath McIver. It's called Survivors Discuss. And we have like panel discussions from survivors and experts about certain topics like PTSD. But I think fiction can be so fun to just get out of your head sometimes. I read a lot of memoir because I'm a memoir writer, but
Yeah.
I love reading a good novel that just gets me out of my little world and think about other people's lives and what's possible. And I think just tapping into your curiosity and your imagination can be a really big stress reliever. Um,
Mm.
and it makes me happy. So I recommend reading.
Yeah. Is there a good fictional book you'd recommend as like a counterpart to Rift?
Oh, well, there is a couple. There's a young adult novel called Quiver, and
Hmm.
I love that book because
It's a great thing.
it's about the Quiverful movement, which is what
Yeah.
I grew up in. And so there's two main characters. One is a girl growing up as a stay-at-home daughter, and the other one is a queer character, and they have this relationship with each other as neighbors and challenge each other's ideas of the world. And I love just the way it's written and how these two teenagers are trying to figure out who they are and how they relate to other people,
Hmm.
and having that two sides effect. So there's the two sides there too. So I love that book. I think that might be a good read.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Kate, thank you so much. I know you're doing so much press around the book, and I appreciate you squeezing me into the schedule to talk a little bit about it. For anybody who hasn't got a copy, go grab a copy of Rift. There's a link in the show notes as well as a link to the playlist. You can listen to that as you go through the book. But thank you so much for doing this, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great time going on this journey.
Thank you so much.